This is Shani. I apologize for our delay in starting this webinar. We had some slight technical difficulties in Paris, so thank you so much for bearing with us. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to our speakers and to all of you who are joining virtually for this transatlantic dialogue with economists Thomas Piketty and Joseph Stiglitz, who will be talking about turning points in today's turbulent world. Je vous souhaite la bienvenue à ce duplex transatlantique entre deux éminents économistes, Joseph Stiglitz et Thomas Piketty. Si vous désirez écouter en français, appuyez sur le globe en bas de l'écran et sélectionnez le français, ou vous pouvez suivre directement sur le site du Monde dans le lien qui est indiqué dans le chat. My name is Shani Peer, and I'm the director of the Columbia University Maison Française, and we are delighted to be presenting this event in partnership with Le Monde, which is the most important and most influential French language media group in the world, and with Columbia Global Centers in Paris. Today's dialogue is a special preview of our inaugural Festival du Monde NYC with the Columbia-Maison Française, which will take place next March 12th and 13th, 2021 at Columbia. Inspired by the Festival du Monde in Paris and Montreal, this special first annual festival in New York City will feature French, Francophone, and American thinkers, artists, and public figures in 2 days of lively conversations, debates, performances, and other special events. We'll be sharing the agenda later this fall, so please stay tuned. Today's conversation will take place in English. If you'd like to listen in French, you can click on the globe on the bottom of your screen and choose French, or listen directly on the website of Le Monde in the link that's indicated in the chat box. We will have a Q&A for several selected questions submitted before and during the event. If you would like to submit a question for consideration, please use the Q&A button. Today's dialogue will be moderated by Sylvie Kauffmann, who is an editorial director and columnist for Le Monde and a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times. I'd like to thank our distinguished speakers and moderator, as well as our co-sponsors, and thank all of you for joining us. I now hand the baton over to Sylvie Kauffmann.
Thank you very much, Shani. Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Et je passe donc à l'anglais. Good afternoon. My name is Sylvie Kauffmann. I am a journalist at Le Monde, and I am going to steer you through this extraordinary dialogue across the Atlantic. I have to say, if something good has to come out of this pandemic, it is the fact that by forcing us to hold this event online, it enables us to address much wider audiences on both our continents than if we were sitting all in a single room. So let's make the best of it. Yes, this has been an incredible year for all of us, and it's not over, as you say over there. As you know, some may argue we ain't seen nothing yet. The virus is still circulating dangerously. Our economies have been put on hold with devastating consequences earlier this year. Gigantic recovery plans are being set up, and billions of public money are going to be spent to rescue our economies. We also have an election in the United States and major unrest in American cities. With 4 more years of Trumpism in the balance, the stakes are high, not only for American voters, but also for the rest of the world. And of course, for us here in Europe, though unfortunately we cannot vote. This has not come like a thunderbolt out of a clear blue sky. Dark clouds had been accumulating for a while, with rising inequalities, questions about the cost of globalization, the challenges of climate change, and China chartering its own course. So we have a lot on our plate for this discussion and the best possible speakers to address these turning points, since they have both produced groundbreaking work on inequalities and globalization, among other issues. It is my great privilege to welcome Joseph Stiglitz, who is joining us from New York. Good afternoon, Joe. If you don't mind me calling you Joe, I am going to see you very soon on the screen. Here we are. Hello.
Hello?
Hello.
I wish I could be there.
Joe Stiglitz, as you all know, is a professor at Columbia University and received the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences in 2001. You know, you've done so many things that I'm not going to waste our precious time with a long introduction. Just to mention that you have made very important research on issues like climate change, measurement of social progress, reform of the international financial system, among other subjects. Your books have helped shape the global debate, notably The Visionary Globalization and Its Discontents, which has been read worldwide, and more recently, People, Power and Profits, which was also published here in France recently. And here with me in Paris is Thomas Piketty, professor at the Paris School of Economics and École des Hautes Études de Sciences Sociales. Bonjour Thomas.
Bonjour.
Thomas is the author of numerous articles in academic journals, but he's also mostly famous for his two books, Capital in the 21st Century, published 7 years ago, and most recently, Capital and Ideology, published in the United States this year by Harvard University Press. Both books have not only been sold around the world, except for China for the last one, since Thomas refused to agree to 24 cuts, I think, requested by the Chinese publisher. They have also fed an intense debate about inequalities and how to fight them. And may I add, Thomas is also a fellow columnist at Le Monde. So we have a short hour ahead of us, and this is how we're going to proceed. In the first half of this session, I'm going to ask questions and moderate a dialogue between Joe Stiglitz and Thomas Piketty. And then we will turn to you, viewers, readers, or listeners around the world, because I think it is truly around the world. And I will field your questions to both our speakers. Joe Stiglitz, let me start with you. I have very briefly described the landscape that this pandemic has created. How do you assess the economic situation now in the United States, roughly 6 months after COVID-19 hit your country? What does it tell us about, what does the situation tell us about the strengths and the weaknesses of the American model?
The American situation is not good, and both the disease and the economic aftermath reflects, as you said, a lot about the pre-existing conditions in the United States. The United States was not prepared. It was not prepared in two senses. It was not prepared in having a good system of social protection, in not having a good healthcare system. This virus is not an equal opportunity virus. It goes after those that are most vulnerable with the weakest health. And as you may know, life expectancy on average in the United States is among the lowest in the advanced countries. But it today is lower than it was 5 years ago. So it's getting worse. And even more important, the average masks the fact of huge health inequalities. So that because the United States is the only advanced country that doesn't recognize the right of access to healthcare as a basic human right, there are large portions of our population that don't have access to healthcare, and because of the poverty, don't have access to good nutrition. So we had preconditions in that sense that made us particularly vulnerable. But there's another sense, we always recognize the importance of government in responding to disasters, to government in natural disasters and all kinds of contingencies. In this particular case, we were again unprepared. We should have realized this. We had been warned by SARS, by MERS, by Ebola. And during the Obama administration, there was set up a White House office on pandemics. In fact, it was set up under the National Security Council because they recognized that it was a threat to our security. But we disbanded under Trump that office. We recognize the need that the private sector is not going to make the kinds of stockpiles that you need in order to respond to a crisis. And so we had stockpiles of protective gear, stockpiles of masks, but the Trump administration allowed those stockpiles to be depleted, even ventilators. And finally, to respond to a crisis like this, you needed science. And every year, the Trump administration proposed 30% cuts in the science budget. Most relevantly, he actually cut the budget of the Centers for Disease Control, the agency that's responsible for responding to contagious disease. So it was a culmination of a 40-year attack on government by the Republicans. And we're now getting the fruits of that. Yeah. They did weaken the government, and now we're suffering the consequences.
And how do you judge the reaction, the response from the government to this crisis? I mean, on the economic side.
On the economic front, part of the problem was they believed or acted as if they believed. We now gotten a record that they may not have really believed it, that it was going to be just a short-term interruption. So the economic plans were based on a V-shaped recovery. It was always a fantasy. Anybody who knew epidemiology knew that that's not how this disease with this kind of contagion was going to play out.
So you mean the response was conceived for a V-shaped recovery?
And it was supposed to be all over by the end of beginning of June, end of June at the latest. And of course, we're now in September, and the end is not in sight. But there were other parts. Some of us were very concerned about the separation of workers from their employers, that we wanted to keep that that connection, especially even more important in the United States than in Europe, because in the United States, most workers depend on their employer for health insurance. And you don't want to be without health insurance in the middle of a pandemic. And there were good models. Denmark early on developed a program. France, New Zealand, all developed ways of doing this. The United States, Trump proposed something, that, a payroll tax cut for the corporations that would do nothing about the unemployed and do nothing really about this connection. And the compromise that evolved had the banks at the center. And the banks were not concerned about helping the furloughed workers. They were concerned about helping their connected friends. And so the result of that was the United States has had this enormous increase, this spike in unemployment. You probably followed it. It reached over 15%. And if you look at the true unemployment rate, it still remains roughly at that level or even above that.
It has decreased now.
Well, the official rate is. So the question is, what is the true unemployment rate? And for instance, just to give you a flavor, this week, the newly announced numbers of unemployed, new unemployed applications, this is months after is over 800,000. And under the new programs for what are called freelance workers, people who were not previously eligible, another 800,000. We're talking about 1.6 million new applicants for unemployment in just 1 week.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much for this somber description, I'm afraid. Thomas, it's listening to Joe Stiglitz, it seems that in Europe we are doing something right, but what is your opinion about the situation? And how do you assess the situation in not only in France, in Europe, because we also have the European Union as an actor here?
Right. So first, let me apologize that my English is going to sound a lot like French, but at least for the French speakers, this will sound familiar. Let me also reinforce a point that Joe made about the US situation, which is that given the US has a problem with inequality, it has a problem with its health system, and even before the pandemic, the last time we had a country with a declining life expectancy in peacetime was the Soviet Union in the 1970s. It's quite unusual, to have a decline in life expectancy in peacetime in a very rich country, much richer than the Soviet Union at the time. And so this reflects, deep problem with inequality, with the health system. So from that viewpoint, the situation in France and in Europe is obviously better. Although, we should, what we have learned also in this crisis is that, our public health system is not quite as good as what we thought before. And everybody was, very surprised in France to see that we didn't have the mask. And, even 6 months after the beginning of the pandemic, you have queues in the street of Paris of 400 meters to get a test. You wait 4 hours to get a test. Nobody really knows who should get tested or not because the capacity to test the population is very uncertain. So, I think we all have to be modest about, our, the national social system and how much we need to learn from this experience. Now, there's been a response at the EU level, which, you referred to, and the recovery plan that was adopted over the summer by the European Union is indeed a big novelty. And if someone has said, 6 months ago or 1 year ago, okay, we are going to borrow 400 billion together, 319 billion together to distribute it directly to national budget, nobody would have believed it. So it's clear that the COVID is completely changing also the political landscape, the ideological landscape. Again, we should not overestimate, the amount of what has been done. And 390 billion euros, that's a lot of money, but, the GDP of the European Union is more than 40,000 billion euros. So this is less than 3% of European Union GDP. This is supposed to be spent over 3 to 4 years. So this is an extra 0.5% of GDP per year. Is this going to be enough? I'm not so sure. And also, maybe the main limitation of what we've been doing in Europe is that we've still not changed the basic political functioning of the European Union, which is that we rely on the unanimity rule to make any decision of this sort, which clearly we see the limitation of this system. And in my view, maybe it would have been preferable to have a recovery plan adopted by a smaller number of countries than the 27 countries under unanimity, but with a smaller number of countries making the key decision to move to majority rule decision making on budget, public debt, taxation, recovery. Then I think we would have had not only a bigger recovery plan, but we would have most importantly, change the condition under which future decision will be made in Europe. And so maybe this is what we will do in 6 months, 1 year, but we always postpone the real change in Europe. And maybe we will realize in 6 months or 1 year or in a couple of years that we didn't use this opportunity to change the rules of the game as much as we should have.
Joe, I would like to ask you, I have to go quickly to further subjects because time is really flying. On globalization, what do you think will be the impact of this crisis on globalization? Because you a long time ago, almost 22 decades ago, you mentioned the discontents but now we're really in the thick of it, and we have, including not only the America First policy, but on this side of the Atlantic also, this talk about relocalizations, new supply chains, etc. What is your assessment of? Is this a fundamental change we are going to act on, or is it just more just discontent and nobody is really ready to act?
Well, there are two sides to the issue. On the one hand, what we realize is that we're sharing one planet, just like climate change makes us realize we share one planet. Those nasty viruses don't carry passports or visas, and they go anywhere in the world. And as long as there are parts of the world where the disease is spreading, we're all going to be at risk. So, and we will all benefit by the global efforts to develop a vaccine and therapeutics and to learn how to deal with the disease. So in that sense, there's been actually a support for globalization, for multilateralism, the efforts at the WHO to develop a global framework for sharing the vaccine, and the efforts in the scientific community to share their knowledge have been truly impressive. I have friends who were working on this, and they said they've never seen anything like this. So that's the positive side, that there is really a strengthening of multilateralism and a realization that we share one planet. That will be, again, very important as we need to deal with climate change. The other side is that we've realized that we've constructed a economic system that's not very resilient. And one part of the lack of resilience is global supply chains that are not resilient. We saw that so vividly in the United States, where here we are, supposedly the richest country. We were not even able to produce masks, let alone, or protective gear, let alone more complicated products like tests or ventilators. So there are huge deficiencies in our market economy that were exposed, and those were related to some extent to the lack of diversified, resilient global supply chains. And that occurred in the midst of another drama that's been going on. We shouldn't go into it here, but that's the drama between the United States and China over a whole host of issues, from human rights having to do with Hong Kong and the Uyghurs, to security, surveillance, privacy, and so forth. So that clearly is complicating the globalization agenda, and will continue to do so for coming years.
Mm-hmm. Thomas, to pick up on this positive sign that Joe Stiglitz identified, do you see in this crisis also an opportunity? A lot of people in Europe hope that this is the opportunity to move forward to a greener agenda, for instance, to a better, to build a better future with a greener agenda, with more taking into account better concerns about environment, social concerns also. With this public money which is being invested now, do you think we can fix those major flaws that you have both been talking about?
Well, in principle, we could, but at this stage, I think there's a strong temptation, just to redo what we did before in terms of sectors. There's a big risk, I think, that we make also the same mistake with the monetary policy that we did after 2008, 2012, which is that we use the new monetary policy, the new money supply, basically to boost stock market prices, real estate prices, which is going to benefit those who own already a lot of assets, a lot of wealth, but that's going to increase inequality, and that's not going to solve our problem with the environment, our social problem, our problem with inequality. So I think we should really change the way we think about monetary policy. In terms of environmental policy, what we have, for instance, in recent weeks is this quasi-military fight in the Eastern Mediterranean about who is going to get the oil and the gas in the Eastern Mediterranean. And as you very well know, if we want to be serious with the Paris Agreement, in fact, this gas should stay where it is. Nobody should get it. And in fact, the discussion that we have is, is the French Navy going to help Greece to fight with the Turks so as to respect colonial borders that were drawn in 1920? We are back to It's not only the word of
This is
yesterday; it's the word of a
yeah.
century ago. And and we've started to authorize again a new insecticide and product for sugar production in France, which we had decided to ban a couple of years ago. And look, the argument that was made is, okay, these are really bad insecticides, we should not use them. But look, other European countries have started to use them for their sugar production. So if we don't do the same, we are going to die. But look, there is another solution. And the other solution is if some other countries do bad things with insecticides or carbon emission, there should be a carbon tax at the frontier, and we cannot wait again for unanimity for this to happen, because this race to the bottom on the environment and social matters. And last and not least, I want to say that to me, what's the worst part is that what's happening in India or in West Africa or in the global South, where we urgently need to develop a safety net system. Because if you have a lockdown in India or in West Africa and you don't have a minimum income, what are people going to do when they're going to have to go out and get work and get food in one way or another? And so this would be an opportunity to build this kind of system. But again, this also depends on the global economic system, as Joe was saying, which is with the kind of financial opacity we have in the global economic system today, it is very difficult for poor countries, to develop an equitable way to tax multinational, to tax high wealth individuals, and to build trust in government and in the possibility to deliver public services and social services. So we are all bound together to try to improve this global economic system.
Yeah. So you both agree that that could be an opportunity, but we are not there yet at the point of structural changes or change of paradigm. Joe, I have to turn now to the issue of the US presidential election, because we are all, of course, very interested in its outcome after this, at the end of this very awkward campaign. What do you think of the economic program put forward by Joe Biden, the Democratic candidate? As Obama's vice president, Joe Biden appeared very much as a centrist, but he has obviously taken some ideas from Bernie Sanders' program. Is this a left-wing program? And do you find there some elements of the progressive capitalism that you have been advocating?
I think the way to think about it is the entire country has moved in a more progressive direction. And I try to capture in my book the spirit of where progressivism is in the United States today. The word left wing in the United States has taken on a certain tinge where Trump wants to paint anybody with that label left wing as being in the same camp as Maduro or Stalin or something like that. So words have to be used fairly carefully in that context. But I would use the word, a long-standing progressive agenda, which is concerned with making the economy actually work better by competition law, by enhancing workers' rights, by preventing exploitation in all its forms, including the exploitation of the environment and of our planet, but also recognizing that where we are today in the 21st century, a basic middle-class life is not accessible to very large portions of America. And so the agenda that he's talked about is very much where I think most Americans are, which is they want the minimum wage to be much higher. It should be closer to a livable wage. They want access to health care. They might want to make sure that everybody who's qualified to go to the university should be able to go to the university. The average level of indebtedness of America's graduate is like $30,000, and it's going up. We are closing off opportunities. The idea of American dream is now really a myth. So he has grabbed that. He's put all, that is basically his agenda, with a couple of other things that have, I think, become particularly highlighted by the pandemic, which is we've seen among the people most affected are our care workers. And they are the frontline workers, depend on them. And then we recognize they're getting afflicted by the disease more, but they're getting paid less. So an agenda to do something about our care workers, which says something about ourselves, our identity, what kind of society we are, he's put that up very much at the front of his agenda. And I think that makes a lot of sense, particularly in the light of where we are with this pandemic.
Thomas, what is at stake in this election for us in Europe?
Well, what's at stake is, the possibility to have just a normal partnership with the United States on the climate and capitalism, the economy, cooperation and taxation. We were together this afternoon with Joe in a meeting for the whole afternoon in an international independent commission for the reform of corporate taxation. This is something that, with Joe Biden could make progress, not as much as maybe was that with Elizabeth Warren or with Bernie Sanders, but certainly a lot more.
As you would think, as you would hope.
A lot more than with Donald Trump. And, I think, look, in this primary election in the US, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren got huge support, especially in the youth. And when I say the youth, it's not just under 25. If you take, according to polls, if you take voters below 50, they got actually much more votes than Biden. And so, I'm not saying we should only have the below 50 who vote, but this means that the US public opinion, especially on the Democratic side, has been moving, and I think it's Joe Biden will be well inspired to take some elements from their program, which he did to some extent, but I think insufficiently. I think the idea of a wealth tax is important because we live at a time where top wealth holders, not only in the US but across the world, have grown a lot faster than the size of the economy. And when you have something that's growing a lot faster than the size of the economy, it's not that you want to expropriate everybody, bring it to zero, but it makes sense to ask to this group, more contribution to the public good, especially in a time like this. And the income tax is not quite going to do the job. So we'll have this discussion again and again, but I think it's all these discussion, of course, taking place in the US are very important also for all of us in Europe and in the rest of the world.
And Joe, talking about wealth tax, where do you stand on this between where Elizabeth Warren campaign for I think 2% wealth tax on above $50 million, and this is I guess peanuts for Thomas.
No, but Bernie Sanders proposed 8% on billionaires, and then Elizabeth Warren went to 6%. So they are competing. I think they're moving in the right direction.
Okay, and what do you think, Joe?
Well, I think a wealth tax is a good idea. And the point is, because we have so much inequality in wealth, even a moderate rate, like 3% on the billionaires and 2% on those over 50 million, raises an enormous amount of revenue. One of the important points that we discussed this morning in the meeting that Thomas referred to was that the wealth tax often can get income that can be tax things that can be avoided or evaded through capital income tax. That sometimes you can organize ways of avoiding taxes, income tax, so that the wealth tax can actually be a very effective tax. We had a representative for Columbia talk about how they had originally introduced the wealth tax many years ago on that basis. On the other hand, I also think we can't forget that we have a regressive capital taxation in the United States and many other countries. Many countries don't tax capital gains, so that income of workers are taxed at a higher rate than people who are just clipping coupons or making income from capital. So the wealth, getting a wealth tax doesn't substitute for eliminating the deficiencies in our income tax systems.
Okay. This is the last question from me, and then we'll move to our audience. And Thomas, I would like to talk about an issue which is very important between the US and Europe. It's the big tech and tech giants, not only on the issue of tax, but also on the general issue of the model. The German Foreign Minister Heiko Maas recently said there are two models. And I'm quoting him, the Silicon Valley model, which is about maximizing profits, and the Chinese model, which is about repression and authoritarianism. Europe, he said, has to find another way. What do you think of this description, and what could be the, for the digital economy, and regarding this problem we have with the tech giants, US tech giants, what would be the European model?
Well, I think the solution is democratic socialism or participatory socialism, as I described it. So, Joe is for progressive capitalism, but I prefer participatory socialism, which I think is exactly what, Europe has started to build over the past century. So if you think of, German companies, for instance, you have half of the seats in the board of companies that are occupied by representative of workers. This is not a perfect system, in particular, because in the end, the shareholders always have the decisive vote, and, the system couldn't be improved in many different ways. But I can tell you that this makes already a very big difference as compared to a system where you have 100% of the voting right for shareholders, or in system like in China, where the state and the Communist Party has the final say on everything. So this is already an intermediate model, which is a quite a significant transformation of the entire property structure, because it means that if in addition workers or a regional government have a 10 or 20% share in the capital of the company, they can shift the majority, including against a shareholder who has an 80 or 90% share. And I can tell you that when this was introduced, shareholders were very unhappy about that. And if we were trying to do that in France or in other European countries, in many cases, we will need to change the constitution a little bit, which the German did in 1949. And I think this kind of European model should be developed. And in fact, there was a time in the 70s and 80s when Germany tried to pass a European directive on corporate governance, trying to generalize this model, but the French at the time didn't want, and many countries didn't want. This is just an example. Now, coming to the tech giant, I think, this is basically the same general answer, which is that we can have democratic regulation of capitalist forces, and in the case of tech giant, it's clear that you cannot have, so much power, concentrated into one or two or three private companies. So either it makes sense to break these monopolies into several entities, or if from a technological or organizational viewpoint, you don't want to break these entities like, railway company, SNCF in France, which you don't necessarily want to cut into two, then you need to have very strong public regulation of what they are allowed to do or not on European territory. And I think this will have to come. The ways you can pay on Facebook to get more viewers, and the way, the entire process of diffusion of information, for political campaign in particular, has been perverted by the fact that we let pure capitalist forces basically do what they want. And this also involves taxation. But it goes well beyond taxation, and I think Europe will have to propose a much broader model to regulate capitalism. If you only focus on the big tech companies, then there's a risk that the US reaction, especially with Trump, but also with Biden, will be, okay, you do that because we have the tech giants, but then we are going to tax your luxury giants, your wine, everything. So I think it's important to articulate a model of economic regulation and taxation that is universal in its scope, in the sense that it addresses the issues for all sectors, with broad principles. And I see a risk with the French current ideas of focusing on the tech sector, including with the Biden presidency.
Do you agree, Joe? And do you think a Biden administration would make things maybe easier for us on this aspect, on this front? Can you hear us? No.
Oh, yes. Can I, before answering that, let me just want to very strongly support what Thomas said. This on Sunday is the 50th anniversary of Milton Friedman's article arguing that that companies should only maximize stock market value, shareholder capitalism. So it's an interesting time to ask that question. And just a year ago, the Business Roundtable in the United States said Milton Friedman was wrong, that companies, even American companies, said that there ought to be pursuing a broader set of agenda. They should pay attention to the environment, to their customers, to their workers, to the communities in which they operate. Back in the 70s, I wrote some scientific papers showing that shareholder value maximization did not lead to the well-being of society. But I published them in the Quarterly Journal of Economics and the Journal of Finance, but not in the New York Times. And Friedman's rhetoric had more influence in legislators than my more mathematical formulations. But over the long run, I have to say, after 49 years, my views turned out to win over Milton Friedman's, if actually America makes the kinds of corporate governance changes that both Thomas and I think that needs to be made. In the particular area of tech, again, I want to highlight what Thomas said. It's just about taxation or competition. It's all about a whole set of abuses, including concerns about political manipulation, hate speech, incitement, misinformation, disinformation. So, and Europe has been working to get a regulatory framework. Mm-hmm. Come to your question, there is a broad consensus among Democrats that we need to do exactly the same thing. We need to have a stronger competition policy. And it's not just breaking them up. It's also making sure that they don't engage in a whole host of anti-competitive practices that we've seen on the part of Facebook and Google and the other tech, Amazon. So I think there will be actually a much broader understanding of the need for regulatory framework that Europe and America can agree on. And it's a very different framework from that where China has, because we don't want the surveillance state. We want to maintain a certain degree of democracy and privacy.
Okay, well, thank you very much. We've had, now we know what progressive capitalism is about, and we also have on the European side the participatory socialism. So that is quite interesting. We have a lot of questions from our viewers and listeners and readers, and some of them are about, many of them actually are about the debt issue, and on both sides of the Atlantic. Actually, we have Bolivar Alvarez, who is asking how can countries get on the path of economic recovery with the high levels of debt that they currently experience, and that will continue to increase, of course, with the present situation. And we also have Nakak from Le Monde website, who is following this on Le Monde website, who is asking questions in the same, also about sovereign debt and how we are going to deal with all these debts. And there seems to be a consensus, or a lot of economists seem to think that we can afford those such a high level of debt. What is both of you? What are your views on this? Joe, maybe we start with you.
Yeah, I'm not right now worried about the debt. I'm more worried about not doing something because of fear of the debt. If we don't stimulate the economy in the right way and have a adequate recovery, there will be long-term damage, and recovering from this downturn, this pandemic, economic aftermath of the pandemic, will take years and years and years. So it is really important to do something. Now, the cost of servicing that debt with interest rates close to zero is close to zero. So there is not a problem right now in servicing the debt. Much of the debt is actually one part of the government owing money to the other part. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet holdings of debt has expanded greatly. So if you netted it out, it's not anywhere near as what it was. I think it's important to use our money very well. And one of the problems was that the $3 trillion that the United States spent was not a very well-designed program. I mentioned before how high our unemployment went. One of the things, picking up on the theme of inequality, is it showed a very deep rift in our society. About half the population is living paycheck to paycheck. And the moment they get money, they spend it. And that stimulates the economy. The other half is very well off. They've not even lost their jobs. Their pay is doing well. And the average savings rate in the United States, which is normally close to zero, last quarter was 25%. And that means the upper half was saving well over 25%. So we have to be very thoughtful of how we use the money. And that's where Vice President Biden's agenda of build back better becomes very important. What we want to do is, as we spend the money, make sure the money uses dual purpose. So we spend the money to help move our economy to what we might call the kind of post-pandemic economy we want, a green economy, a knowledge economy, a more equal society. These all that vision ought to be very much at the forefront of our spending.
Thomas, you agree?
Yeah, let me remind you that we've already seen even bigger public debt than this in history. So, after World War II, we had up to 200%, 300% of public debt in many countries. And what the historical experience shows is that, there are different ways to get rid of that. So if you take the case of, Germany and Japan after World War II, they used a lot of exceptional wealth tax in order to reduce very fast the public debt. Other countries use more inflation. In France, I think exceptional progressive wealth tax is better than inflation, which Germany experienced in the 1920s and somehow did not want to do it again. And so it's partly why they invented in the late 1940s, early 1950s this exceptional wealth tax, which had the same impact. So the difference today is that we have invented this new solution somehow, which is that our central banks are taking a big part of the public debt on their balance sheet. So this is another way indeed to get rid of the public debt. The only problem, as Joe was saying, is that the way we use this monetary tool today is that in effect we are boosting stock market prices, real estate prices. We are creating a huge gap between a zero interest rate for people who have just a little saving on their bank account and people who can borrow at zero or close to zero and invest it on the stock market, invest it in housing. So it's possible that this monetary policy, in effect, is increasing inequality in rates of return across society, across the distribution, and in the end is contributing to raise inequality, and so you solve one problem on the one hand, but you create another problem. Yeah. So I'm not, in the longer run, okay, nobody knows whether interest rate will increase in the future. It could be that central banks in the medium run will be able to keep them very low, but with this price to pay in terms of very high inequality in rate of return, So the bottom line is what we've done so far, the way we use our central bank to solve some of the problem is not going to be sufficient in the long run. We'll have to think more about the combination of monetary policy, progressive taxation that will solve in the long run this very large level of debt. So there are solutions, but we'll have to address the problem at some point in an imaginative way.
Yeah, it seems that we are going to require a lot of imagination in this situation. There's a very different question about democracy and also about populism from Ivan Paravitz in Chile. It's a very simple question. Do you believe that democracy is coming to an end? This is an easy one for you, Joe. And for Thomas, how do you see, that's from Fernando Eichenberg, how do you see the populist and the far-right threat today? Has this speech been somehow emptied, or is it still as a big threat as it was before this crisis happened? So, Joe, why don't you start?
Well, there's a lot of concern and discussion in the United States about exactly that question. And let me try to explain why that is. Over the last 40 years, one of our two parties, the Republican Party, has become a peculiar coalition of evangelical business leaders, a whole host of peculiar, coalition, and a peculiar coalition that basically advocates positions that are held by a minority of the population. A majority of the population, and as Thomas pointed out, a vast majority of young people are in favor of things like an increase in the minimum wage, healthcare for all, access to education for all, including universities, preschool, a whole gun controls, all these are a position held by the vast majority. Now, in that context, what happens to a minority party, and a minority party that is whose base is a shrinking part of the population? Their constituency is based on the less well-educated. They've very small representation of people of color, very rural, and the country is becoming urban, very diverse, and better educated. So what do you do if you're in that kind of minority position? Well, what you do is you engage in an anti-democratic agenda of disenfranchisement, disempowerment, and putting democracy in chains. You do things like you make it more difficult to register and more difficult to vote. You engage in gerrymandering. You put a lot of power, money into politics. And the net effect of all that is really to undermine democracy. And the culmination of this is that President Bush got elected as a minority president. President Trump got elected as a minority president. And the concern is that this may happen again. And it's not only true of the presidency, the vast majority of Americans voted for Democratic candidates for the Senate, but we have a Republican-controlled Senate. So there's a growing sense of a large Democratic deficit in the United States. How this will play out will depend very much on this election.
I think nationalist parties and extreme right movement, are still a huge threat in the US, in their own way, in Europe and across the world. And I think the only way to fight this threat in the long run is to reopen the discussion about different economic system and different economic policy. You know, I think the problem is that for too long, for many decades, we've told the public opinion that, you know, there's only one possible economic policy, that there's nothing government can do to change the economic system, to reduce inequalities, that the only thing government can do is to control their frontiers and to control their identity. And then, you know, you should not be surprised that 20 years later, 30 years later, the entire political conversation is about border control and about identity. Because, you know, if you tell people there's only one centrist economic policy and no, you know, other policies, and, you know, the political fight is going to be about identity, and that's very worrying to me. So I think it's really key and central to reopen the economic discussion if we want to avoid this extreme racial polarization of the political fight, which we see with this election in the US, but which is also rising in Europe. You know, in Europe, you know, the fight about you know, extra-European migrants, about Islam, you know, has grown, you know, in the past 10 years, 20 years, and you know, the risk that we get to a very racially polarized in its own way politics in Europe is very, very real.
Let's go back to economics. A French reader on Le Monde's website asked, you know, talks about the prospect of having massive unemployment and people laid off when bankruptcies are going to happen on a massive scale. And he asked whether we should consider again a basic income. And so should that be considered, and how would it be financed? Maybe Thomas? Or,
well,
yeah.
let me say that many European countries already have a sort of basic income, in the sense that there is a minimum income, which can be, you know, 500 euros per month, 600 euros per month, which we may want to raise, which we may want to distribute more automatically, but which already exists as a basic minimum income. In the US, there does not exist such a basic minimum income, and you have food stamps, you have various income transfer if you have dependent children, but typically single individuals have you know, only have food stamps for various historical reasons, which have to do also with the racial prejudices, I think, and the specific antagonism of US society. But in the European context, I think the real issue is to make the administration of the basic income more efficient, more automatic. You know, many homeless people don't have access to it, so we have to improve how it is administered, make it more automatic. In particular, when you move from zero job to low pay job, to part-time job, to full-time job, this must come automatically on your wage, on your wage that you receive each month. You know, you must have the extra income supplement. You don't need, you should not ask for it and wait 6 months, and when your situation changes. So this has to be a lot more automatic, and that's of course very, very important.
Can I just add one point to this?
Go ahead.
As I look at the world right now, there are an awful lot of jobs that need to be done. We face a green transition. There's going to need to be a lot of investment that's going to be needed. There are a lot of people that needed to be taken care of. We need to build a lot of infrastructure. So to me, the first objective of government should be to match people who want to work to jobs that need to be done.
How do you do that?
It's not been doing that very well. So I would like to put more emphasis on making sure that we provide jobs for everybody who is able and willing to work. Now, unfortunately, there's going to be cracks in the system, and that's where the basic income comes in, to make sure that nobody falls into those cracks. But I'd like to emphasize the importance right now of there's so many tasks that our society needs, and there's so many people who do want to work, that we really need to make sure that we match the two together.
Yeah, but we do have the same problem in Europe, you know, with, you know, high, I mean, at least in France, high still high unemployment and a lot of jobs vacancies. So is it only about education, about training? How do you match them?
Well, I think in some cases we should just create also more jobs, in health, in education, in the thermal renovation of building, which is something we've been talking about forever. But in fact, even with the current recovery plan, we're probably going to deal with a very, very small fraction of the buildings and dwellings that should be renovated. So, you have lots of jobs here to be created. And I think, the problem is that there is this sort of ideological view that because these are public sector jobs, in health, education, or, public works, we should not do it. But, these sectors are going to be very important in the future. We have to think of how we organize them in a decentralized manner so that they deliver the right public services where they should. But, we are not going to organize the health sector or the education sector or public work of the future through a shareholder company and pure capitalist company just to please some ideology. Because this doesn't work. Many sectors, typically the health sector, in countries where it's purely capitalist, it actually costs more money and it's less efficient in terms of public health. So we have to be pragmatic. And right now in the recovery plan, I see, some resistance, including in France, to invest more in just creating jobs in these sectors.
Okay, a last question, I'm afraid, but it's a big one. It's about China. Actually, this Brian Spence is asking, who's been watching this discussion. He says, should the growth of China's economy make Western democracies and their citizens think twice about their contribution to this growth by their growing dependency on Chinese manufactured goods? And what political impact on mainland China could an organized grassroots boycott of Chinese exports have? And would you support such a boycott? Joe, we'll start with you.
Well, that's a big question. Let me put it very more broadly.
Yeah.
I think that at the end of the Cold War, there was the hope that, Francis Fukuyama wrote this wonderful book called The End of History. And the hope was that we would all become liberal democracies and free market economies very quickly.
Swedish social democrats, yeah.
Exactly. And that trade would facilitate all that. And we would be one happy global family. Well, things have not worked out quite so well. And that China did move in a way that looked like it was moving toward a more open economy, but then it stopped, and it's become less open than it was, more authoritarian. Problems in Hong Kong, the problems with the Uyghurs. So
what went wrong? What went wrong? What went wrong?
Well, that would be a long discussion of the internal politics of China that would take us beyond this discussion. And let me, I can tell you that there's not unanimity in China. A lot of people are not happy about the direction in which things have gone. Not a surprise. This is true in any society. But the point is that we're making is that the world today is different from when it was 30 years ago. And the hopes that we had 30 years ago have been dashed. And at the same time, technology has changed. So technology, what we've been talking about, has given authoritarian governments instruments to be even more totalitarian than ever before. 1984 was a fiction, but the fiction of 1984 in 2020 may actually be a reality, and that is very disturbing. So it is very clear that Europe and the United States are going to have to engage in a discussion. This discussion has been muddied by Trump, who has been engaged in a narrow view on trade with perspective. It's all about zero-sum trade. Their gain is at our expense. The waters have been muddied by focusing on bilateral trade deficits and multilateral, a lot of small issues. You know, I don't want to say too small, but he has muddied these waters that are really about human rights and what kind of society by things that are of second order. And I think it really is time for Europe and the United States to think about what kind of a global society that we want.
Absolutely. Thomas, you have the last word on this.
Well, you know, I think what went wrong is that we should never have had free trade in exchange of nothing at all. You know, I think free trade and international economic relations in general have to come as part of a package, you know, where you have some common goals regarding the environment, regarding cooperation about the fiscal system, about the financial flow, about the regulation of the banking system. You know, this has to come as a package, and this is going to be the same issue, you know, with Britain, with the discussion over Brexit. You know, I think we have to say, the European Union has to say clearly and as soon as possible, okay, this is the kind of tariff that you will face. 10%, 20%, I don't know, a set of goods, but we have to be very concrete about this very soon, because if we keep pretending that you can have, you know, 0% tariff in exchange of nothing at all, you know, whatever you do, and you can have a completely uncooperative strategy, which is also the problem is this is very often what we have within the European Union. You know, the Netherlands behave like a tax haven, and they can still pretend, you know, to be a frugal country in spite of the fact that they still 10 billion euros in tax revenue from the rest of Europe through, you know, by attracting book profits that do not correspond to any real economic activity. You know, that's uncooperative attitude. So we have to change this idea that you can get free trade, free capital flows without anything in exchange. So I am for the circulation of goods and services and investment, but we need to take into account, well, first, the environmental cost. So if you have huge transportation of goods, at the very least, you should tax the carbon content of that. But more generally, you have to participate to the construction of an equitable economic system, an equitable tax system, regulation of the financial sector. And so we'll have to move away from this illusion of you know, self-sustaining free trade, free capital flows without a global development model to defend.
Okay, I think there are a lot of illusions we are moving away from these days. Well, unfortunately, this is the end of our talk. This is another illusion I had, that we could continue for another hour, but we'll do that again. Thank you very, very much to our two speakers for this fascinating discussion, which was organized jointly by Le Monde, la Maison Française of Columbia University, and Columbia Global Centers, which hosted us here in Reed Hall in Paris. Joe Stiglitz, goodbye. It was fantastic having you.
Bye-bye. Wonderful being here.
Thomas Piketty, merci beaucoup. I would also like to thank our translators, Rebecca Reynaud and Antoine Viau. And thank you particularly to all of you for those excellent questions. We could have fielded many more. See you next year at the festival. And I hang the baton back to you, Shani, in New York.
My thanks to yours. First, to thank you, Sylvie Kauffmann, of course, editorial director and journalist with Le Monde, and a contributing opinion writer to New York Times. You were the perfect person for this role. Thank you so much to Thomas Piketty and Joseph Stiglitz on behalf of all our co-sponsors here with us. If you've enjoyed this preview, we invite you to join us in person next March 12th and 13th, 2021 at Columbia for the inaugural Festival du Monde NYC with the Columbia-Maison Française. We are also offering some lists of readings that were put together by Columbia Libraries and Le Monde, and you can find a link to these related readings by pressing on the chat button. So that concludes our event. Thank you so much for joining us.